Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. And welcome to our special Sunday edition. This day, July 26th, 1969. The Chappaquidick incident is on the front pages of newspapers a day after Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy pled guilty to a charge of leaving the scene of an accident. The accident, which was about a week earlier, involved a single vehicle on the island of Chappaquidick, which is on Martha's Vineyard, I believe. Kennedy was driving, and his companion, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne, was trapped in the car after it crashed off a bridge into water. Kopechne died in that accident. For his guilty plea, Kennedy received a 2-month suspended jail sentence. And listeners, if you can tell, I'm treading a little lightly with the sketch of the details here. That is because one of the reasons we want to talk about this is because so many of the details are murky, and so much of the fallout from this incident has been controversial for decades and at times conspiratorial. So I need some help talking about this. Luckily, I have 2 people here to help me do that. Nicole Hemmer of Columbia, as always, is here. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And special guest Maeve Higgins of the New York Times and the podcast Mothers of Invention and lots more, back for her 3rd episode in a row. Hello, Maeve.
Thanks for having me, Jody.
Is this a scandal that you heard about growing up in Ireland?
Yeah, the Kennedys are huge in Ireland. You know, they're Irish Catholic background, and we were so proud of them. And I mean, I didn't hear about it at the time, you know, because I wasn't born, but definitely,
fair.
I guess it was the type of scandal that followed him around. And Ted Kennedy had a lot to do with the Northern Irish peace process and a lot to do with, you know, he was a huge figure in Irish America, but there was always like this horrible cloud that like he killed somebody.
Yeah.
I guess.
So, Nikki, where do we start on this? You want to start with the details of the case or the sort of legacy that Maeve is referring to?
Let's start with the details of the case because it's very easy to get sucked into everything that happens after, because this does become, as Maeve was indicating, not just a mark on Kennedy's record that would follow him throughout his life. It would be in all of his obituaries, but something that so quickly got soaked up by political scandal machine that a lot of what actually happened gets glossed over. And I should say, because so much of what happened isn't clear, this is one of those things where you can Rorschach out because there's just too much that we don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there are questions about his behavior. There are questions about how these 2 ended up in a car together. There's questions about his sobriety when the accident happened. There's questions about his behavior immediately afterwards. Some of his initial public statements didn't match up with what police claimed he made in his reports. I mean, when it starts to then become a sort of more public story, Nikki, what are the details and the discrepancies that people most pick up on?
I think the thing that people really latch on to is that this accident happens. He goes off this bridge that doesn't have any guardrails. A clearly tragic accident happens. He comes out of it. He's understandably probably confused and in shock, but he doesn't report it for 10 hours. He goes back and he hooks up with his friends and they try to figure out what to do, and whatever they figured out did not involve bringing the police in. And I think that then opens the door for all types of conspiracies, but also just like legitimate wonderings, like what did they try to do? Like, were they trying to cover up intoxication? Was it just that there was a lot of confusion and uncertainty? Was it that the water was too strong and they couldn't make it and they misunderstood who was going to report what? I mean, there's a lot of again, like just a lot of wiggle room here. But I think it's those 10 hours delay in reporting that are the big thing.
It's such a long time.
It is.
Isn't it?
It is.
It's such a long time. This is like so dumb, but I was watching Succession, that show, and there's like, I guess they took inspiration from that horrible thing. And in that case, it was like a wealthy, entitled person who was kind of responsible for this accident that killed not a famous person, not a privileged Kennedy, you know, whatever. And so I guess that reminded me of it too. And also that like this actual person died and now she's just become like a story that's attached to him. It's like, you know, how did it affect him and what did but she was like this actual person. So it's kind of disturbing in that way, right? That like I don't really know anything about her actually.
I think that's actually the most important part of this in terms of the historical legacy is that so quickly she became just a stand-in. She could be anyone, right? There was a headline that was something like Kennedy accident, blonde dies, and like her name isn't even in it. He didn't know how to spell her name. And so she gets, if not entirely erased because her name's still known, she's just a stand-in for other things. And when he does this public television apology, it's kind of all about him and what it means for him as a man and as a politician and how he will overcome it, and not so much about this woman who lost her life at a pretty young age.
So what should we know about Mary Jo Kopechne and why she was at Chappaquidick? And I will confess that before we started researching for this episode, I didn't really know much about her story.
Her story is that she was one of these women who was volunteering for Bobby Kennedy in the 1968 race, one of these people who like really believed in this kind of idealistic campaign that Kennedy was running. And there was a group of women who became known as the Boiler Room Women who banded together and who were helping Kennedy to win this race, and then he's assassinated. And in the years that followed, they would get together to remember their time together. And actually this gathering out in Chappaquidick was the Boiler Room Women. And so her political history is a big part of this story.
And, you know, in the wake of that speech, I will say Kopechne's mother sort of said that she was satisfied with his statement and said that I hope Kennedy doesn't resign and stays in the Senate, which was a big part of, that was the thrust of his speech was, I feel bad, but I'm not going to give up any of my power. In the years since, in the decades since, the family has kind of said that they never felt like the Kennedys truly made peace and reached out in ways that matter to them. But, you know, I want to get to this bigger idea of the Kennedys and what they represent. And this notion, Maeve, you kind of got to it, of impunity and royalty, and how we have this fascination with the Kennedys and we want them to be above and special. And then these things happen and they act above and special. And it's kind of like, well, this is what you get when you bestow special status upon people. They act with impunity.
Yeah, and as well, this thing of like, there's a curse on the family. Right. First of all, there's no such thing. Second of all, if you do get to have this like wealthy patriarch and then no rules apply to these big, powerful families and they love doing wild things, then there's a logical explanation. They're not supernatural people. So when this like curse thing comes up, I'm always like, ugh, that's creepy.
Yeah.
And it's like that royal family thing, right? Which I'm always bewildered by why Americans like love the royal family, because the whole point of America was to like break free of the monarchy, but they just keep replacing them again and again, these abusive kind of people.
Well, and the Kennedys were the closest thing that America ever had to a royal family. There was one point in the early 1960s where John Kennedy is president, Bobby Kennedy is attorney general, and Ted Kennedy is a U.S. senator. I mean, that's an incredible concentration of power. And two of those stories, of course, end really tragically. And so there's a way in which, you know, all of the questions of extraordinary wealth and privilege and bad behavior don't necessarily stick to John and to Robert Kennedy precisely because their stories end so tragically. And so it all sort of lands on Ted Kennedy, who, of course, helps out by being pretty dissolute for any number of years.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, this is a thing that follows him and comes up throughout the decades. There is a case to be made that there were potentially some presidential runs in Ted Kennedy's future that he didn't take on because he had this in his past and it would have brought it back up. That said, he still had an incredibly powerful and long career. And so, Niki, I'm curious, like, if you can help us track how this story, the scandal sort of attached to him through the years. Did it mostly live on the right? I mean, that's where you would expect to live, right?
Yeah, I mean, any sort of Ted Kennedy opponent is going to mention Chappaquidick because it really is this albatross around him that remains throughout his career. But it's particularly in conservative circles and Republican circles that Chappaquidick becomes a byword, not just for Kennedy's own immorality, but sort of the decline of liberalism. Like, this is actually what liberalism is. It is abusive. It has all of these unintended consequences. It's about privileged, coddled, protected people. And Ted Kennedy is kind of the embodiment of that. And so this tragedy becomes, you know, more of a useful tool for trying to discredit Democrats. And so on like Rush Limbaugh's show, he nicknamed Ted Kennedy the swimmer. And that was meant to sort of indicate. Yeah, I mean, it's horrible because it's this whole tragedy that's just put into this throwaway nickname. And then he would have little ditties that he would do. It gets really gross really quickly if you go too far down that road.
But I wonder if he would have just, you know, I mean, faced the consequences or like somehow dealt with what happened, then maybe it wouldn't have shadowed him for the rest of his life. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it still would have been used by his political opponents, but I would not say that he crowned himself in glory by the way that he handled the aftermath.
Right. I mean, this gets to a more high-minded idea, but it's like when you're powerful, the notion of giving up even just a little bit of power feels so impossible. But actually, like, you can give up a little bit of power and still be really powerful. He still would have been Kennedy. He still would have had a political life if he had just acted forthrightly and responsibly. But that's just not, I think, a lot of these people are wired. Niki, am I wrong, or like, is my sense that this has also come a little bit from the left too in recent years, particularly around kind of like misogyny and a sort of using the Chappaquidick incident as a way of looking at the way Kennedys and the left and this sort of like era of great American liberal men have not been good on gender?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important that in the Me Too era in particular, but even before then, there was a real reassessment as more and more women were allowed into the historical arena to say, the way John Kennedy treated women seems not great. And in the case of Ted Kennedy, we definitely have these stories of him forcing himself on women who did not consent to that. It was even written up in a really joking manner in the magazines of the time where he assaults a food server. And so this is definitely part of that recounting is talking about the way that this liberalism that was supposed to be helping all of these people was being brought to us by men who didn't, in their personal lives, treat women in particular very well.
Well, I still want to marry a Kennedy. Sorry, guys.
You will have your chance, I'm sure.
And it's like, but if you champion healthcare, then that glosses over everything, all of your personal failings. I mean, yeah, it's like...
That is the big debate.
That is the
But
big
wasn't there also like tons of women in their family, but they were not as successful politically? Like, that doesn't add up to me.
Yeah, I mean, there are people like Carolyn Kennedy who has had a well-connected and high-powered career, but the Kennedy women were not always pointed to the path of politics, and in this generation wouldn't have had nearly as many opportunities to do so. Okay,
anything else you want to bring up?
Yeah, so because I was doing this show this week and thinking about these dates in history, this was the day, like the day the accident happened, that was the day that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were scheduled to set foot on the moon. And then your producer, Jacob, found this amazing fact, which is they had pre-taped all these interviews with Ted Kennedy, who was like a big deal at that time, just, lauding the moon landing, and they were ready to play them. And at the same time, almost, the scandal broke. And only ABC went ahead and used their clip of the now disgraced Ted Kennedy. And it's just like the need for content then was like almost as like all pervasive as it is now. It's just lucky he didn't have Instagram. That's what I think is, and everybody at that party. Can you imagine who was tagged and who wasn't? Like it would have been clearer to find out what actually happened and why they were there together. But I mean, lucky for him, all he did was appear on ABC that same morning being like, hey, check out the moon landing, which it didn't work as a distraction.
Well, that's one of the things I like about doing this show is you get these moments where you realize like, oh, in the same week in 1969, Chappaquidick and the moon landing. And yeah, there's like headlines at the time. It's so related to now. Not that we look at newspaper front pages much anymore, but like, you know, you look at a newspaper front page from this week and it's like Nixon making war plans, the Apollo 11 and Chappaquidick all in equal columns across the front. And it's just a reminder that we have had crazy moments like this before.
Yeah, totally. Because everybody now is like, 2020, don't you dare, not one more thing. But it's like, we've been through this before.
All right. And we will continue to talk about it. But that is the end of this episode. So Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Maeve Higgins, thanks to you. And thanks for doing these last 3 episodes. This was really fun. And I will just say you're one of my favorite people in the real world and also talking into microphones. So thank you for coming on.
Jody, teaching me about America.
Don't worry. We're all going to be making plans to move to Ireland pretty soon. So
You're so welcome.
Okay. You're saying that into a microphone that is getting published. So we will hold you to that. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. We will be back on Tuesday with another episode. In the meantime, you can check us out on social media at This Day Pod on Instagram and Twitter. My name is Jody Abergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Whatever the future holds for me, I hope that I shall be able to put this most recent tragedy behind me and make some further contribution to our state, mankind, whether it be in public or private life. Thank you and good night.
Radiotopia.